Okay, so let's play some Galaga. Do 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 do. Need to figure out, get some speakers going on. Okay, this is trying to play this one-handed. Wee! Boom, boom, boom. Okay, so we have a proof of concept. So there are a lot of projects that involve putting a Raspberry Pi Zero into an original Game Boy case. And I wanted to do something like that, but with a few variations. I wanted to avoid dremeling out and widening the screen if possible, because my dremeling skills aren't very good and it just winds up looking mediocre. Also, I wanted to try something with a processor with a bit more heft than the Zero. The Raspberry Pi B models are way too big to fit in a Game Boy shell, but something like the Raspberry Pi 3A fits quite nicely. So here I soldered in one of these special not too tall headers that Adafruit sells to keep the overall sandwich small. And the other thing is this design very heavily hinges on their 2.4-inch screen, which besides fitting nicely in here, has these little pins on the side to break out basically that original 26-pin connector set. Some of the other parts of the 40 pins you can access up here, but I thought it would be nice to be able to do this all with one header. So, been working on making a custom header for that with this DuPont housing that plugs into that side. You can crimp your own connectors here. I like to buy, I think I got these from Adafruit, these connectors that have the female headers pre-crimped on here that go inside one of the DuPont housings. They'll look like this. So you slide them into here and you make sure you've got the little notch lined up so it clicks into place and holds. And that's just faster and easier than crimping your own connectors. Anyway, I got these Raspberry Pi Zero button boards. You can usually buy these a la carte, and instead of using the rest of the appropriate board that hooks into the Zero, we'll make our own connections here. But I did run into a problem. This particular board, if you look at the standard header spacing, the holes are more closely spaced than your standard 0.1-inch header, just by a little bit. And I can, of course, solder the wires. I could clip these and solder them directly into here, but I'm particularly interested in trying to avoid having to solder things in permanently while I'm in the prototyping stage. I'll prefer to do that with headers. I wanted to use something like these angular headers. So there's the Tinkerboy board, which has the same problem, but the opposite direction. If you look at the header pins, they're spaced a little bit wider. The ones on the end here are actually spaced even a little bit further out for the L1, L2, and R1, R2 and the ground over here. But the rest of them are spaced a little bit wider than your standard 0.1-inch headers. But after a bit of experimenting, I found you can put the 0.1-inch headers, you can put two next to each other, and they'll reasonably fit. So I'm thinking if I do two header, two header, two header all the way down, I can fake something that would work okay. And so the general idea here is that the sandwich with the Raspberry Pi 3A of the screen would go in here, nicely mounted somehow. And then the Raspberry Pi button board will go in here, something like this. And then I'll probably have the pin headers not on top here, but I'll mount these on the other side. So these can come out and then I can still not block access to the HDMI port and other stuff if I want it. So that's the plan. One of the goals of this build was to avoid doing heavy modifications on either the Game Boy case or the Pi or the LCD board. I did wind up having to snip a tiny bit of plastic off of this connector on the end here that was sticking up and would prevent me from plugging in the header because of the thickness of the header. So I took some snippers and just clipped that little bit of plastic that came up. And this is a connector for either the camera or an LCD screen that fits that particular protocol. Either way, I don't think that's a feature that's used very much. And if I didn't do that, this was just a little bit too thick to fit in the Raspberry Pi shell once I put the back on, without maybe taking off the touch screen, and I wanted to leave that on, at least for now. And these header pins in little groups of 2 fit in here pretty snugly and were relatively easy for my son to solder. Having one header pin by itself generally doesn't work very well, so I went ahead and just soldered in a cable for that. And for the sake of posterity, the upper left pins here, the one in the upper left and the one next to it on the upper row are 5 volts, and the one next to it is ground. So that's how we can keep track of where the pins are. Okay, so this plugs in all the way on the left. So there are pins on the right here that aren't used. Well, they're not used by this connector. Those are mostly actually used by the display. So on the top row, the first 3 don't have anything in them because that's 5 volt, and ground. Then there's 3 GPIO, and then we skip. And then there's a GPIO. The one we're skipping is another ground if we want to add that later for whatever reason. And then on the bottom row, from left to right, there's an unused pin, there's 3 GPIO pins, and then there's a ground. And that one I did plug in a ground. And then there's 3 other GPIO pins, and then there's 2 on the right, actually on both rows, that are unused. Okay, so I've plugged in my little header and nothing's exploded. So let's see if we can tweak the files and such to have button presses be interpreted as keystrokes. And we can test that without plugging the whole thing in by using the ground wire I have here and touching those to the signal wires. So we have RetroPie already, and I finally got the wireless working on here with the wireless at my house so that we can install Retrogame, which is Adafruit's tool for setting up the GPIO pins. We'll have to change this anyway, but I'll just go ahead and pick Super Game Pi for now. I think I'm going to have to change the configuration file, so might as well not reboot yet. Okay, so now we need to change this boot/retrogame.cfg file to correspond to my scheme in terms of what pins correspond to what. Okay. So the left joypad, I map to pin 15. The right joypad, I map to 23, and these are not the physical pin numbers like the 1, 2, 3, 4 if you're looking at the side of the Raspberry Pi header. These are the Broadcom GPIO. Let's see. So up, what did I do for up? GPIO 14. Down is 18. Okay, let's see. ZX on the keyboard map to A and B buttons. Okay, so I see what they're doing here. The Retrogame maps the GPIO to key presses, and then in RetroPie we map the keyboard presses to the various controls. All right, so the A button is going to be pin 17. The B button is going to be pin 4, the way I have this set up. The select button is going to be pin 2, GPIO pin 2. Okay. The start button is going to be pin 3. Okay. The X button is pin 22. And the Y button is going to be pin 27. All right, and right now I don't really have any mechanisms to put in left and right shoulder buttons anyway, so I'm not going to worry about that now. This was marking that GPIO pin 24 is reserved by this fancy TFT LCD screen. Okay, yeah, I guess we'll go with that. Let's see, I'll go ahead and leave GPIO 8 and 11. I don't think I'm actually using them here. And I don't think they're used by the TFT display either. So we'll just leave those alone for now. And you know what? I'm not sure about having the select button be mapped to the escape key. The escape key is usually something special in pretty much everything. So let's change that to space. Okay, and there is this ability to have a special key. Let's make that the escape key, that's special. Be activated by holding down a couple of buttons for a few seconds, I guess. So let's say if we hold down A and B, which are 4 and 17. So 17 is A, GPIO 4 will be B. So this will theoretically give us an escape. Okay, let's reboot. And now I'm just getting a blank screen. Let the debugging begin. Oh, you know what? The screen uses the SPI interface, and the SPI interface shares a pin with GPIO 11 that I think was one of the shoulder buttons or something. So, let me check into that. Okay, so I took the screen off to see if it would talk to the HDMI just automatically, but it does not seem to want to do that. Have I locked myself out of my Pi? Worst comes to worst, I could make a new retro Pi image. I would rather not. Okay, yeah, so that was the issue. I was able to plug the SD card into my laptop and edit it there. Let's test by shorting, say, this wire to ground. Okay, so that goes up. The purple, let's short that to ground. Actually, 18, pin 18. This guy here, this blue, if I short it to ground, I should be able to facilitate a down. Whoop. Oh, that facilitates shorting out the screen. Okay, that's bad. We'll have to see what's happening there. Let me go back. I use the keyboard there to go back. Let's try left and right. So the purple, if I map purple to touch purple to my ground pin. Okay, that goes left. What about right? Let's see, that's the white cable. Let's short that to ground. Okay, so that is going to the right. Let's see if we can get in the menu here by shorting ground to pin 17, which should be the, let's see, green, I think? Yep, okay, that went into the RetroPie mode. Let's see if we can back out again by shorting to pin 4, which I think is the blue. Yeah, so I think that's activating a B. Let's see, the main problem we had with was trying to facilitate the down operation, also made the screen go blank. Oh, I didn't think it was set in the mode to do this, but I believe pin 18 is part of a supposedly optional, or at least in my impression, optional PWM control of the backlight. And I thought I had this in a mode where that wasn't an issue, but it looks like that's a problem. So I may not be able to use 18. Let's try something else. Okay, so this is a bit kludgy for the moment. I'll have to deal with the down connection when I get back in the office and have the soldering iron handy. I'll probably hook the down to number 5, and I had to do something a little kludgy temporarily with the left and the up for the moment, but we'll fix that another time. Let's see if this works. Okay, so we have the buttons and D-pad in place. And now we have our little flexible contact thingies. Okay, so we're ready to do some testing. To get everything to fit, I wound up leaving the up and down disconnected for the moment. The screws here are random screws that I had lying around. These are not the original ones. I'm not sure where the original ones are. Maybe they're in a box at my office somewhere. Anyway, let's check this out. The one thing I did discover in my prototyping process is that my attempt to have this all work with these nice headers isn't going to work. There you go. Okay, it's going to have to go in here, kind of this direction. And if we do that, you know, obviously I would have to shorten the cables a lot. But even if I do that, these header pins just come out too far. There's not enough space for these to bend over nicely once we put the sandwich in. Okay, talk to you later.